So, Lone Rider here. Want to talk about something a little different, and this is something that I came across the other day. Made me think, and maybe it should make anybody think. Maybe it's something we should all think about. So I was reading the current issue of the Smithsonian Magazine. There's a neat article in here about Jack London and some other things. Article about correspondence from soldiers in World War II and other wars. And then there's this, plus roaring through Cuba with Che Guevara's son. As you can see from the headline there. Now, I actually read the article because I'm curious, right? Anybody would be curious, I guess. But like many people who value freedom, human dignity, liberty, I'm not a big fan of Che Guevara. And I remember growing up back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when it was very popular for young people in particular to wear Che Guevara t-shirts. And I always wondered if the people who wore the Che Guevara t-shirts actually knew anything about Che Guevara. As I understand it, rather than being some brave revolutionary and fighting for the people and yada yada, as people want to romanticize Mr. Guevara, as I understand it, his main role, the thing that he's mainly remembered for by Cubans, aside from being part and parcel of the communist revolutionary squad that eventually gave birth to the Fidel Castro dictatorship in Cuba, and therefore, replaced one tyranny with another, and led to conditions on Cuba being what they are, and people wanting to, get out and be free. And you had for many years, and still do, people trying to flee the country. Aside from bequeathing Cuba a communist dictatorship, or helping to do so, Mr. Guevara's main role, as far as I've been able to understand, was that of an executioner. Apparently, he was not a very good soldier. He apparently was a fairly inept soldier, but he was very good at shooting unarmed people, dissidents, women and children, political prisoners, people who were captured or had surrendered, in the back of the head. So basically, he was an executioner, and apparently, he enjoyed his job as an executioner. He enjoyed shooting defenseless, captured, bound people in the back of the head. This is not an individual that I think anybody should emulate or look up to or wear on a t-shirt. It would be like wearing a Stalin t-shirt or a Hitler t-shirt or a Chairman Mao t-shirt. Like, why would anybody do that? And I honestly don't know. But it was interesting to read this article about Che Guevara's son leading motorcycle tours in Cuba, only because there was literally nothing in the article that talked about anything bad about Mr. Guevara. Right? There was never any mention that Che Guevara's son was conflicted about the fact that his father was a mass murderer and executioner, a man who was partly responsible for establishing a brutal dictatorship that suppresses free speech and so on and so forth. There was a lot of talk about how Mr. Guevara's son was, found it kind of difficult because of his father's notoriety and fame in Cuba. But the nature of that notoriety and fame was never really touched on, right? They talked about Mr. Guevara as a leader, as somebody that was revered. Well, of course, if you're looking at the official view, I guess, of the Communist Party in Cuba, it's going to be that this is one of their their bigwigs, their founding people. He's going to be highly regarded. But again, as far as I understand it, his major role, his major contribution, aside from being part of the team that bequeathed Cuba a dictatorship and a communist regime, his main contribution was shooting prisoners in the back of the head. And that's not something that I think anybody would regard as admirable. And again, I don't understand why people, whether it's people here in the United States, young people wear Che Guevara t-shirts and think that he's cool and he's some big shot to want to emulate, or why you would have an article in a reputable magazine like the Smithsonian, which is devoted to things like examining history and that sort of thing, where they talk about Che Guevara, and in particular Che Guevara's son, and Che Guevara's son living with the legacy of his father, and yet they never touch on the nature of that legacy. They never talk about who Che Guevara is, and he's a murderer.